Conditional statements are used if we have an expression that needs to evaluate to be true, and based on that we will execute a piece of code, or otherwise we will provide another piece of code that will be executed if that is not true. The most famous conditional statement in any programming language is the if statement, and we write it like this. So we say if, and we write parentheses, and now we write these, well, curly brackets. What we type, or the expression that we type between these parentheses, needs to evaluate to be true so that the piece of code that we enter here will execute. So we can just type, for example, here true, and this is the Boolean value that we were talking about. So now we can just say debug.log, and here we can say, for example, this is true like this. If I go back into Unity and I run the program, we will see that this is true has been printed out in the console. So if I go back here, and instead of true, I write false. So let me just type that, right? So it's false like this. Then this here will not be executed because this statement here is not true. So this code here will not run. If I go back and I run the program, we see that nothing has been printed in the console. Since our expression evaluated to be false, we can use the else statement to provide another piece of code that will be executed. So here we can say else, and we can provide an additional piece of code which will be executed in case our first statement is false. So here we can just copy and paste our, well, debug.log, and for example here we can say executed in else, like this. If I go back and rerun the program, so I'll just clear the console and rerun it, we see that executed in else is executed or printed out in the console because our first statement is false. Now we can use multiple nested if-else statements. So here we can also use else if, and we can check another condition. So here we can say also false, for example. And after that here we can also say else if, and also provide another, well, statement which we want to check if it's true, and we will, well, execute the code that's here. And lastly, we can use, for example, like a default value, we can use else, meaning that if all of this here is false, then execute what is, well, or the code that is here. Now, most of the time we are going to compare variables to each other. For example, if the player's X position is greater than or equal to or less than enemy's X position. For that we use the comparison operators. So I will erase this code here. And for example, if you want to check if 3, and we can use the comparison operator greater than 4. So we can check this condition here, and if it's true we will execute this piece of code. Now this is false because 3 is not greater than 4, but we can check if 3 is less than 4, and also, or excuse me, this expression here will evaluate to be true and this piece of code will be executed. We can also check if it's less than or equal to, or greater than or equal to, or we can also check if it's equal to using the double equal sign. Not to be confused with one equal sign, which assigns a value to a variable. Double equal signs checks if this value here on the left side is equal to the value which is on the right side. We can also compare strings using the double equal sign. So for example, we can check if string hello like this is equal to, and we can type another string, for example, hello. Now if this is true, in this case it is, this code here will be executed. Now we can also check for multiple conditions. For example, we can check here if 3 is greater than 4, or, and for that we use this pipe sign or this double pipe sign, and this means or, and here we can say if 5 is greater than 4. Now what this means here, if this expression here is true, or this expression here is true, this code here will be executed. So one of these expressions here needs to evaluate to be true in order this code here to be executed. If both of them are true, then this code will also execute. Only if the both sides here, or the both expressions here, are false, then this code here will not be executed. We can also check using the AND operator, so this double AND sign, and this means that if this expression here is true and this expression here is true, then this code here will be executed. If one of these expressions is false, or both of them are false, then this code here will not be executed. Earlier we saw that we can have multiple if-else statements. what I forgot to mention, that we can also have nested if-else statements. And that means that we can have if statements, inside of if statement. For example, here we are checking one expression. Now, if that expression is true, here we can check for another expression. So we can say if something here is true, then we can execute this piece of code. Here we can also use else, so on and so forth. Now, what I wanted to show you is that if we have multiple or nested if-else statements, our code can get messy. For that, we can use the switch statement, and it goes like this. For example, here we can declare a variable a is equal to 5. Now here I can type switch, and inside of these parentheses I will add my case, and I will pass a, which is this variable here. And inside of this switch statement, now we write cases. For example, case 1. This means that if variable a, which we are passing here in the switch, is equal to 1, then we will execute this code here. For example, we can say debug.log, and here we can say a is 1, for example. And after that, we need to use this break here, the keyword break, which will break us out of this switch statement. So here we can write, for example, case 2, and here we can also write a piece of code that will be executed. And here, for example, we can say debug.log, and here, let me just, erase this, and here we can say, for example, a is 2. And here we can use the default case. If you remember, I told you if we have multiple if-else statement, in the end, we can add only else statement, which will act as a default. Well, in switch, we can actually use a default. So here we can say default, and here we can, write a piece of code. So here we can say, for example, debug.log like this, and here we can say a is not 1 nor 2, for example. And now, if I run the program, we will see that a is not 1 nor 2 will be executed here, because here we wrote that a is equal to 5. Now let us take a look at loops. And we use loops for multiple repetitions of a single task. The most famous loop is a for loop. And let me quickly write a for loop. So for int I is equal to 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus. Now this here means for integer I, which is equal to 0, as long as I is less than 10, execute the code that is here that many times, and then increment I. This piece of code, or the code that we provide here, will be executed 10 times as long as I is less than 0. So from less than 10. So from 0 up to 9. So here we can say, for example, debug.log, and here we can write executed and then plus I. Now this here is called string concatenation. We use the plus sign to add to a string. So in this case we are adding I, which is an integer. We can also add a string or a boolean and so on and so forth by using the plus sign, and as I said, we are adding it to a string. And we can say again here plus, and we can say, for example, times like this. Now if I go back here into Unity and I run the program, we see that executed 0, 1, 2, 3 up to 9 times, in total 10 times has been printed out in the console, which we specified here. And for loop is used, primarily for processing arrays, and we will see that a little bit later when we begin to work with arrays. Another type of loop that we have is called a while loop, and it goes like this. So we can say while, and here we write an expression, and as long as this evaluates to be true, then the code that we provide here will be, executed. So here we can say, for example, int I is equal to 0, for example, and here we can say as long as I is less than 10, or not greater than, less than 10. And here we can say debug like this, debug.log, and again we can say, for example, executed, and here we can say plus I. So I'll just say plus I. But remember, regarding while loops, it's very important that we provide a condition that will end, or eventually evaluate to be false, or otherwise we will run into an infinite loop. So if we run this now, this will be an infinite loop because I is 0 and 0 is less than 10, and this will execute forever. So here we need to say I plus plus. As I said, we need to provide a condition that will eventually evaluate to be false because we want to break out of the while loop. So if I go back here, I will clear this, and when I run the program, again we see executed 0, up to 9 times. Again, as I said, the most common error with beginners is that, well, when using a while loop, they run into an infinite loop. So when we use a while loop, remember to, well, add a statement that will eventually evaluate to be false, or otherwise we will, well, be stuck in an infinite loop.